Welcome to Short Takes on Geography with Dr. Lisa Benton Short, Professor of Geography at the George Washington University and Chief Reader of Advanced Placement Human Geography. Join us as Dr. Short interviews Dr. Parag Khanna, geostrategist, world traveler, and best-selling author, discussing central concepts in the AP Human Geography curriculum through the lens of his new book, Move, The Forces Uprooting Us. This discussion series is brought to you by the American Geographical Society, the foremost champion of geography for the benefit of society since 1851. And now, over to Dr. Lisa Benton Short.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the fourth in our series of conversations around AP Human Geography. I'm joined again by Parag Khanna, who is leading us in this wonderful discussion about some of the big and critical trends that we're seeing across AP Human Geography, but how they're also the big and critical trends that we're seeing in contemporary society. And so in Unit 4, we explore political patterns and processes. And this is really a unit that's concerned about how we organize space in terms of governance and relationships between space and politics. And we organize political space in many different ways. And again, kind of reinforcing that notion of scale of analysis, we can organize space in neighborhoods, in cities, in states, and even bigger regions and empires. We're not going to talk so much about neighborhoods today, but I want to talk a little bit today about, why political geography is such an important part of what is happening that is challenging us here in the 21st century.
Well, I wonder, Lisa, if, so many students are familiar with empires, right? It's one of the first things we start to study. My daughter already started doing units on ancient Egypt in the third grade. And so, young people know their ancient history, the history of empires like the Roman Empire and the Mongolian Empire were continental in scale. And of course, today we know we live in that political geographic world of bordered nation states. We know where our borders are. We know the names of our neighboring countries and their flags and so forth, and where we are on the map. But what do they have in common throughout history? What is the actual geographic seat of power of any nation or of any empire going back thousands of years? And it is the city. So we don't tend to think of cities as being a political unit in and of themselves. We think of the nation as being the power, and the city is just whatever city you pick to be your capital and where the president or the prime minister sits. What if it's the other way around, Lisa? What if for the last, 7,000, 8,000 years, it is the city that sets the rules, the city where the leaders congregate, the city that is the most organized unit? And whether it's a state or an empire at any given time in history, it's just whatever is built up around the people and the leaders of that city. And in a way, that is what what history proves to actually be the case. Because if you look at some of the dots on this map, some of the cities, places like Cairo, places like Istanbul, now these are some of the longest continuously inhabited cities in the world. They have witnessed empires, the Byzantine Empire, the Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, European empires have come and gone. Cairo is still there. Istanbul is still there. It's changed names, but it's very much still there. So I think the city needs to be appreciated as a central unit of human political organization. And the other forms are constantly, forming or collapsing, right, rising and falling around them. And what's more is that because we live in a world of, rapid urbanization, right, the majority of the human population is now concentrated in these cities. And so they have a certain gravity, if you will. And I'll give you a couple of examples here. If you look at Lagos, Nigeria, there in West Africa. I've made a kind of, caterpillar shape around it, because actually Lagos, as students would know, is actually not the capital of Nigeria. Abuja is the capital of Nigeria. So Lagos is not the political heart of Nigeria, but it is the economic, commercial capital of Nigeria. And it is the most important economic entity in all of West Africa, arguably in all of Africa. In fact, the GDP of just the city of Lagos is about the same as the entire country of Kenya, which you see off to the right where Nairobi is. So the gravity of a city can be way more important than just its geographic size. And we're seeing that phenomenon around the world where, a city is not just a demographic hub, but it has these linkages. And that's why functional geography and mapping the functional geography of connectivity between places tells us a lot more about their importance than just their size. Russia is still the largest country in the world, but the economy of Russia is about the same size as Spain or Italy, despite its size. And the city of Moscow does not rank as one of the most important economic cities in the world anymore. So looking and investigating these cities is, I think, really, really important. Now, let's bring it closer to home. What if we wanted to remap America? Many of you would have read that book, How the States Got Their Shape, and thinking back to how we created our internal state boundaries, roughly 200 years ago. If you were to start over today and say, do we need to have rectangular shaped states of similar total square, mileage defined by latitude and longitude? Is that practical? Is that useful? Or could we look at it according to cities? And yes, America has 50 states, and perhaps it always will have 50 states. But what in day-to-day functional life it has is about 40 urban metro regions that are the hubs for most people's lives. And your economic life may very much revolve around a city that's in another state, but you don't really even notice it because you seamlessly cross to that state. So what you're seeing here is a map that was created by looking at people's phone calls, their commutes, when they drive, and their credit card spending. And what you can see is that basically the 300 million Americans, wherever we are, really operate according to these 40 clusters. And these are 40 urban clusters that define our life morning, afternoon, and evening, much more so than the 18th and 19th century map of the 50 states. So I think this is a powerful example of data science and many different data sources, and visualizing them and superimposing them on top of our political map. So Lisa, do you think this is a better way to organize the world?
Well, I am kind of biased. I'm an urban geographer, and at heart, I believe that
that's the
cities,
best kind. An urban geographer.
Cities are just, such center, poles of power, economic, cultural, social, and increasingly political. And a lot of times in political geography, we tend to focus more on the nation state and forget the role of the very local. I'm always amazed at how much cities can get done that nations oftentimes struggle to do at a national or a federal level. City governments can be incredibly nimble. They have tremendous control over land use. How they protect and use land is going to have a huge influence on natural resource use and consumption. It's going to have an impact on the opportunities for people that live in those metro areas. So I'm so glad that you actually wanted to start our political discussion about kind of the power of cities, and particularly the role of global cities or world cities, because those are really kind of the command and control centers of the global economy. So we might be talking about, empires or nation states, but we're also seeing kind of the role of the local, the urban, become a really powerful political presence in the map. So I want to ask you, are nation states going to be relevant in a world or even in the United States that looks like this?
Well, yes, and no. We actually have more sovereign nation states than ever before, right? 200 nation states, and every year or a couple of years, or in some periods like the 1990s, we create dozens of new countries. And certainly after World War II, with decolonization, we created dozens of new countries. In fact, the 200 countries in the world today is about three times the number of countries as there were after World War II. So most of the countries of the world, modern sovereign nation states, didn't exist before 1945. So we're still in a phase of creating more nations. And in that sense, states, of course, matter more than ever because people still aspire. There are nations of people who don't have states and they aspire to them. And I think many of them will still get them. And therefore, states do matter. But at the same time, to survive and thrive in this century, you have to create connections across states. It's not enough just to own your own, sovereign island. You need to be connected to others in order to have an impact in the world, to get the resources you need to import things and export things and so forth. So I think that we will have more states, but the ways in which cities connect to each other, to get back to your point, is also really a driving force. In fact, I'm a student of diplomacy, Lisa, and the origin of diplomacy 4,000 years ago in the ancient Mesopotamian river valley is actually the exchange of briefs, of mandates, of commercial codes between the cities of that geography of ancient Mesopotamia. And so actually, I've modified the word diplomacy. I call it diplomacity, right? The diplomacy among cities is the origin of diplomacy. Now, for all the students who do Model United Nations, you represent sovereign governments and nations, and we're taught to believe that, of course, certainly in the 20th century on and beyond, diplomacy is that which is done between sovereign nations. But remember, though, if you go back 4,000 years, it's really the diplomacy among cities that is the origin of diplomacy itself.
Well, let me show you a quick map here. All right, so I want to get your take on this. So, we've got some forces at work, and some are kind of destabilizing forces, and some are stabilizing forces within, political geography. And so these are two different maps. One at the top is one, I don't know if you know about Pangea, but the idea here is that, at one point, the plates were closer together. The land masses were kind of, all collected together. And yet the map on the right is kind of the breaking apart, right? So there used to be a Sudan. Now there is both a Sudan and a South Sudan, one of the newest countries to be recognized by the United Nations. So I'm wondering, what do you think the future holds? Are we going to see more or less political stability? Are we going to see, more calls for the creation of new states, the devolution of power to autonomous areas, or do you also think that this could be a point in which the political boundaries seem to start to matter less and we begin to kind of come back together?
Mm-hmm. I see both happening at the same time. And in a way, let's talk about timescales, which you raised in the introductory unit. So if you take your map on the top of Pangea, which is millions of years old, millions of years in the future, all the continents will come back together again, and it's going to be called Amasia. So if you took the longest possible timescale, we go from Pangea to the drifting continents back to Amasia, right? Now, geologists tell us that that's where we're headed. So on a much smaller, more digestible timescale, we have this devolution and fragmentation that you're talking about with the birth of South Sudan and other new countries. But we also have aggregation. And that aggregation is happening through things like the European Union, for example, or the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in Southeast Asia, ASEAN. And even through trade agreements like the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, which is the successor to the NAFTA agreement. So yes, on the map, on the political map, we have more division than ever. But if you look at rules and norms and diplomatic interactions, we actually have lots of very practical aggregation that is actually very representative of our lives. So again, within Europe, you no longer notice even when you cross a national border, right? They've taken down all the border checkpoints. They share one currency in most European countries. So they have aggregated. Now, on a political map, you still have a separate Germany and a separate France and a separate Belgium. And we perhaps will for decades and decades and centuries to come. But that doesn't mean that devolution has prevailed, because you also have the aggregation on top of that. And that is something that actually we're not very good at mapping, in the sense that we could do a better job of mapping aggregation, showing the countries that share currency, that share rules, that share laws. But we still default towards a standard political map in which we basically just show them as separate nations and ignore all of the things that they're doing together and building together.
Well, that is so interesting and insightful. And I want to follow up on that, because, we are seeing those processes of aggregation, the EU as a supranational organization, for example. But at the same time, we've seen Brexit. And so we've seen kind of a rejection of the aggregation. So in part, some of the argument for Brexit was a loss of sovereignty. So if we are seeing kind of the coming together of rules of kind of a quietness of borders where checkpoints disappear, what does that mean for sovereignty?
Well, there are many ways in which we've been transcending sovereignty for years. Again, countries coordinating their currencies and their central bank policies and their interest rates, or agreeing on joint border patrols, or having, weakening their borders voluntarily to let people cross without requiring a visa and so forth. So for every example of a part of the world or a place where a country has wanted to assert its sovereignty and declare its independence and, have total self-rule, you have many opposite examples of countries saying we need to have more trade, more investment, more fluidity across our borders, because it actually makes us more prosperous. On balance, the latter is still what is happening. And even in a case like Brexit, we now have 5 years to look back at the result of that, sort of fateful referendum in the UK from 2016. And what's so interesting is that the UK is now on a mission to be more connected than ever. So yes, on the one hand, they said, we want to leave the European Union. But the strategy they've pursued over the last 5 years is to say, we've left the EU, but we want to have as little friction as possible in our trade with Europe. We need to have a free trade agreement with Canada. We need a bilateral free trade agreement with the United States. We need similar deals with Japan and with India and other countries. So that same England that voted for Brexit is the same England whose diplomats are going all over the world and saying, we want to connect to you. We want frictionless trade with you. We want, digital trade with you. We want to build internet cables to connect to you. We want your students to come to our universities. So we can't look only at Brexit to understand how connected and aggregated Britain will be in the future, because Britain's main agenda today is, in fact, to tie up and link up with as many countries as possible, despite Brexit.
And, so I think just kind of wrapping up for our conversation here, I think one of the things that I think you have really given us some insight on is the idea that, despite what the boundaries are on the political map, countries, communities are increasingly interdependent with each other, and they recognize this. No man is an island, no country can stand by itself. And these linkages are really at the heart of political geography in a really interesting new way. And I think this tension between sovereignty and coming together and recognizing interdependence is really one of the most fascinating parts of political geography in the 21st century. So thanks for joining us, and I hope we see you in our next conversation on agricultural and rural land use.
Thank you for joining us for this segment of Short Takes on Geography with Dr. Lisa Benton Short. Tune in for this and more great geography teaching resources at americangeo.org. Until next time.